Hi, everyone. Good evening. I hope you're doing well. My name is Dr. Kathryn Garforth of Garforth Education, and today I'm going to be speaking with Lynn Givens from Connect to Comprehension. I'm very excited about our conversation because we're going to talk all about reading comprehension and some strategies and skills that students need to develop if they want to be that confident reader so that they can learn from what they're reading and make new connections and understanding. So if you haven't done so already, please take a moment to like the Garforth Education Facebook page so you can learn about upcoming lives that we have scheduled. And then we will make sure you'll get them notified and sent to you when you follow us. So good evening, Lynn. How are you?
I'm doing well, Catherine, and it's wonderful to be with everybody and to talk about my favorite subject, comprehension. This is something that I've been investigating and working on for the last 20 or more years, and learning every day, developing new materials frequently, and it's just very exciting. So I'm thrilled to be talking about this, and thank you for inviting me.
Oh, my pleasure. So why don't you start by giving us a little bit of background about who you are and what Connect to Comprehension is?
Okay. Well, I'm a special educator. I've been doing this for 45 years. Ha, long time. Never wanted to do anything else. Have loved every minute of it. I started out, I'm gonna talk about this, but I want to sort of tie it to comprehension and my journey in comprehension. So I started out as a special ed teacher with a master's degree in a public elementary school in Georgia. And I was given no help in terms of how to teach comprehension. And I had a classroom of severely struggling readers, mostly sixth graders. And I was supposed to help them not just with reading, but also with comprehension. So I had a core reading book. I had a book that all teachers used, and that's all I had. And I really, even with a master's degree, didn't really know much about comprehension. So I muddled through for about 6 or 7 years. And then I was lucky enough to be asked to come to the Schenck School in Atlanta, Georgia, which is a school for dyslexic children. And they wanted to train me in Orton-Gillingham. And at the time, I really didn't even know much about what Orton-Gillingham was. But I said, okay, yeah, sure, I'll do that. And they trained me for a year. I wasn't allowed to teach the Orton-Gillingham part. I taught other subjects until I was fully trained and certified and ready to go. And so that was really exciting. I taught a group of middle school students. And we did a wonderful job. As you know, Orton-Gillingham is so powerful for dyslexic children and students. And so they made wonderful progress in terms of being able to read the words. It's very exciting. But for comprehension, all we were doing really was some of you who've been teaching a long time may know the Barnell Loft series. It's a series of books that are divided into skills like getting the main idea, using the context. And so skills are just sort of parsed out. And so every student had at his reading level a set of these books that he worked through. And I thought, gosh, we're doing such a wonderful job with decoding, with being able to read the words with these kids. We're teaching them about syllables and they're able to take apart long words and read them. But this isn't really teaching comprehension in the same way. So that really troubled me. And I started doing research and looking around. But I really didn't feel too good about it. And then in we know that the National Reading Panel in 2000 came out with their wonderful set of directives in terms of how to teach reading. And that's when we first identified the reading components. When the National Reading Panel said, okay, you should be teaching phonemic awareness, you should be teaching phonics, you should be teaching vocabulary and fluency and comprehension. And everybody went, okay. And they even talked a little bit, the National Reading Panel did, about how to connect these, how to connect all of this together. And that was very helpful. And at about the same time, Dr. Scarborough invented her reading rope, which talked about the fact that we have a language comprehension component. And sorry, I like to talk with my hands. People tell me I must be Italian, but I'm not. We have a language comprehension strand, and we have a word reading strand. And those strands get mushed together, intertwined to be a reading rope. So that if you put all of these things together, you can teach your students to be fluent readers. And all of that was very, very helpful in terms of helping me understand how to teach comprehension. But then the next big step for me was in 2004 when I was invited to become the director of intervention at the Florida Center for Reading Research and to work with Dr. Joseph Torgeson, who's like one of the mega reading stars. I told him it was like working down the hall from Sting, my favorite rock star, but instead it was a reading star, reading rock star. And he started me out in this journey by every day for a month bringing into my office a stack of research articles and books about this high. And my job for the day was just to sit and read, because he said, before you do anything, I want to make sure that you have a solid background in terms of what we should be doing for our dyslexic kids and our struggling readers, those kids who need intervention. So that was my job for a month. And that gave me a lot of the missing pieces in terms of how all of this information about reading fits together, because we can't just talk about phonics and we can't just talk about fluency. We have to think about that reading rope. We have to think about how all of these components fit together for the end goal, which is understanding what we read. So that has been my journey. Along that way, I was asked by a group of people I was working with if I could develop a reading program that was doing some of the same things that I was talking about in the presentations that I was doing at the Florida Center for Reading Research. And at the time, I stupidly said, oh, sure, I can develop a reading program that does all of this. Well, it took me 4 years, but that was the beginning of Connect to Comprehension. And the goal of this Connect to Comprehension reading intervention program, Dr. Garforth is going to post a link, so that you can find out more about it. But the goal of this program is to teach upper level comprehension skills to students who may still be struggling to decode. Because what we find with struggling readers is, number one, they have not ever been able to engage with text that's the kind of text that will help them with comprehension. They're reading simple books, right? Simple books. They may be reading decodable books. The cat sat on the mat. Well, what can you really do with the cat sat on the mat? You can't teach comprehension with those kinds of books. So our dyslexic kids who are still struggling to decode, even though most of them are very, very bright and could learn these skills very easily if we taught them, but they don't have access to the kind of text that will make that possible. So we have to, the traditional way of thinking about this is we have to climb the decoding mountain before we can climb the comprehension mountain. And the idea behind Connect to Comprehension is let's climb both of those mountains at the same time. Let's work on comprehension skills while we're learning all of those other skills, while we're learning phonics, while we're learning fluency, while we're increasing vocabulary. We're also going to be working on comprehension. So we're not going to be parsing these out as discrete skills, but we're going to be working on all of them at the same time and just climbing one mountain. So
that's an important thing to do, right? Because reading comprehension takes on skills from language comprehension.
yes,
right?
absolutely. Absolutely.
And so we can support the child with their language comprehension, and especially when students have accommodations like listening to audiobooks and books on tape, they need to have that listening comprehension component.
Yes.
So these are skills that we can start even when the kids are in preschool to help them take the information out of the text that you're reading to them.
Perfect. I'm a huge fan, Kathryn, of interactive read alouds, starting with very young children and going all the way. I've done interactive read alouds. I did it while I was at the Schenck School with 8th graders. We were still doing interactive read alouds because you can read above the level at which students can decode for themselves. And you can model all of those thinking skills while you're reading to them. You can model, how do you figure out vocabulary words? You can model, how are you able to predict what the character is going to do? So I'm so glad you brought that up, because that's such an important thing that parents can do with their children, that teachers of young children can do, to put that language component into all of this. I'm really glad you brought that up.
Well, and then I also think that it's an important thing for parents to continue on even after their child becomes an independent reader.
Yes.
Right. Because it allows you to work on more complicated texts and actually teach them to dig deeper than just a surface level meaning. Right.
Right. Exactly.
And it helps bring up those weird conversations that are difficult to come across when you're, having an everyday parent-child talk. But if you're reading a book with your child about the subject, it's easier to kind of casually talk about it, and it's more comfortable for you.
Absolutely. I remember reading to my own daughters sitting on a rug in their room. We have twins. When they were 7, 8 years old, sitting on a rug reading The Incredible Journey to them and talking about all of the deep meaning in that book, that if they had read it, and they could read it by then, if they had read it, they wouldn't have gotten that kind of understanding. But like you said, because we could have those deep conversations, they were gaining so much in terms of, how do I think when I'm reading? And I think that's something that we need to do with all our students, but especially with our dyslexic students and our other struggling readers who, as I said before, can't read texts that are necessarily at their intellectual level, because decoding is so difficult for them. Yeah. So that's a really important point. And when we talk about decoding and reading the words, let's talk about, if I can, let's talk about the other components of reading and how those affect comprehension. So we know
we start out by just defining what reading comprehension is, because we haven't really said that. What do we mean by reading comprehension?
Well, it's being able to connect, not just to read the text, but to be able to connect the text with your background knowledge, with what you already know, and with new information to make meaning, to make deep meaning from what you're reading. So it's all about making those kinds of connections as you read. But you have to be able to access your language, to be able to access your background knowledge, and to have personal connections to the text in order to make that deep kind of meaning.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And it's what we can do, like getting that is using our modeling to our children, saying, oh, this reminds me of.
Exactly.
I wonder if that's what they really mean.
Exactly. Those think alouds.
Exactly.
So you're thinking aloud and modeling that kind of thinking for your children, for your students. Critical to do that. Critical to do it. Yes. Because otherwise, just telling them the way that they should be thinking is not very useful. But showing them and letting them hear the way that they should be thinking really makes a big difference. So that modeling is critical.
Yeah, well, and then some of them need that extra questioning and encouragement to draw out what they think about it, right? Especially when you're working with kids on the spectrum that don't naturally come to this, not necessarily as easily, right?
Yes.
They do it very literally, so you need to teach them.
Yes, exactly. And we'll talk about, I want to save sort of later on in our conversation to talk about the importance of getting students to generate their own questions and to self-monitor. But let's save that for a little bit farther on down the line. I wanted to help everybody understand how each of the components plays a role in comprehension. And it's kind of difficult to understand how, yes, we've got to work on comprehension as our end goal, but we've also got to make sure that all these other components are in place. So we've got to make sure that students can read the words that we're using for their reading, not our reading to them, but for what they're going to read. They have to be able to read the words, not only read the words, but they have to be able to read them with automaticity. I have a hard time saying that word, automaticity, which means they have to be able to read them without sounding out every sound, that those words have to come fairly rapidly and without a lot of cognitive energy being used. Because if students are spending so much of their cognitive energy on the actual reading of the words, there's very little left for them to understand what they're reading. So that automaticity is critical. And so you need, when students are reading, you need to make sure that they're reading at a level where they can read the words automatically. And so you're working on helping them read, but you're also having them read books that are filled with words that they already know how to read. And I am a huge fan of decodable text for this purpose. And decodable text means that the majority of the words that are in the text are words that have phonetic patterns that students already know how to read, not filled out with a lot of extra words that are above what they know how to read. So for example, if students can only read words with short vowels, 3-letter words like cat and can, then they should be reading books that have those words, right? To get that automaticity. Now, after automaticity, we're still talking about comprehension as the end goal, but after automaticity, we need to talk about fluency. Because if students are reading words one at a time, they can't make meaning out of what they are reading. So it's very important that we teach students how to read in meaningful phrases. And there are a lot of ways that we can do this. We can use fluency phrases where we take phrases out of the text that they are reading and we work on scooping those phrases and having students understand that that is a meaningful unit, more than one word at a time. So we've got decoding, being able to read the words. We've got being able to see, this is kind of daunting, isn't it? Being able to read the words automatically, being able to read the words in meaningful phrases. We haven't even talked about being able to read them with good expression, but that's also important. And then we have to talk about vocabulary.
We also need to mention the punctuation that they need to be aware of too.
Absolutely, absolutely.
See, I mean, I love the Eat, Shoots, and Leaves kids book for that because it can show you how different two sentences can be just because of punctuation.
Let's eat grandma is my favorite. Let's eat grandma. And let's eat, comma, grandma. Yes.
Exactly. So they need to be brought attention to this.
Absolutely. And that needs to be done, like so much of this, explicitly. We need to teach when you come to a period, what do you do? When you come to a question mark, your voice goes up. When you come to a comma, what do you do? So, explicit instruction is the key to all of this. And especially for dyslexic students and our other struggling readers, we can't leave anything to chance, because I call these my Swiss cheese kids, because there are so many gaps in their understanding. And so we have to find what the gaps are, and we have to plug them up with explicit instruction, with explaining exactly how things work. Vocabulary, let's just talk for a minute about vocabulary. We know that struggling readers, dyslexic students, not because of lack of intelligence, certainly, but because they haven't had access to the kinds of text that their fluent peers have, they haven't been exposed to as many vocabulary words. We learn so many vocabulary words from reading. We learn some from conversation, but we don't learn complicated words from conversation because we don't tend to use complicated words in conversations. So you learn a lot of vocabulary from reading. And so if we have students who aren't at the stage where they can read those kinds of text, they have limited vocabulary. And so we need to be sure that we're taking that into account when we're working on comprehension. Because think about it, if you're reading a book and you don't know, or reading a passage and you don't know every third word in the passage, it's going to be really hard to understand that passage. I have just a quick story, because this brought this back to me so clearly. About 2 years ago, I volunteer at the Literacy Center in Leon County in Tallahassee, Florida, where I live. And they assigned me to work with a 28-year-old young lady who had dropped out of school in 6th grade. She had been diagnosed as dyslexic, but she had been put into an ESE classroom and nobody ever really dealt with her dyslexia. And so she dropped out of school, never having really read. She got by on the fact that she was very, very bright. And so she sort of fooled a lot of people. But by 6th grade, it was just getting to be too much. And she dropped out and she got into all kinds of trouble and ended up in jail. And anyway, so she came to the Literacy Center knowing that she wanted to learn how to read. And so we started out with Connect to Comprehension, which you can use to teach adult readers as well as younger struggling readers. And so we were reading stories and I was pointing out the vocabulary words. Part of this program is to target vocabulary words and to talk about them and to use strategies for learning them in different contexts. And so I started asking her what some of these words meant, thinking that we wouldn't even need to do all of the vocabulary work because she was older and she was obviously very bright. But that was wrong. And there were so many words that she didn't know. And she was embarrassed at first until I explained to her, Crystal, I know how smart you are, but the fact that you don't know these is because you've never been able to read books. And that's the only reason. It has nothing to do with your intelligence. And once she really understood that, she was okay. And we worked our way through these very basic vocabulary words that you would assume a 28-year-old certainly would know. So that brought the point home to me in such a clear way that we need to take vocabulary into account with our dyslexic students. Yes. And work with those words and not assume that they know words, not assume that they know them, but check to make sure. And if they don't, work with them so they can learn them. Isabel Beck, one of my favorite people in the world, wrote a book called Bringing Words to Life. And if you want to read about vocabulary, I highly recommend that book because she talks about what words should you pick to teach And then how should you teach them? When I was in school, we learned vocabulary by writing definitions in a notebook. And she dispels that idea and says that's not vocabulary learning. True vocabulary learning is learning how to use words in lots of different contexts and being actively engaged in talking about the words. And she gives you wonderful guidelines on how to do that. And it was a real aha moment for me when I read that book. Quite a few years ago. So bringing words to life, it's worth getting a copy.
It's more than just putting them on flashcards and going through them in a drill deck, because then they memorize the definition on the flashcard and don't know how to use it in context.
Exactly. So very important book. So Kathryn, I've talked a while. Why don't you talk for a while? It's hard to shut me up.
Oh, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with passion, right?
Right.
Yeah, so comprehension is hugely important, as you were mentioning, and there are many ways that we can help scaffold it into our students' instruction, and not think about, okay, right now I'm teaching reading comprehension. Include it in all of your subjects, right? So when you're doing the science lessons, teach them how to comprehend science texts, because you can't use the same strategies for a fictitious work. The same thing like with poetry and the various types of literature. These are all skills that we need to help students develop. And yes, there are going to be students that pick it up on their own, but having that extra support and scaffolding in place can alert them to other ideas. And just because this child doesn't have a problem with reading or a learning disability doesn't mean they necessarily pick up these comprehension strategies on their own.
Exactly. I like what you said about content area, because I like to say every teacher is a teacher of reading. And I really believe that. So what you're saying is so important, that if you teach social studies, you don't want to say, well, I teach social studies, I don't need to worry about reading, for exactly the reasons that you just pointed out. Yeah, because comprehension goes across math and social studies and science and every other area that you can think about. So
even reading the menu at a restaurant, right?
Yes, that's right.
Okay, well, this is going to tell me what's in the dish that they're trying to sell me, and this is how much it costs me. Right. These are the little, the legend that tells me that it's a spicy dish or a vegan dish or a dairy-free dish. There's all this information that if we don't draw the attention to, we can't guarantee that children are just going to pick up through osmosis. And that's the whole thing that it comes to when we're talking about, the science of learning and the science of reading, structured literacy, structured numeracy. It's making sure that we don't leave anything to chance, because you know what, there's going to be someone in your classroom that needs support in it. And it only takes that little bit of extra effort on your part to make it explicit for the students, to model it for the students, so that they can have it, and it's going to make your job easier. You will see more huge leaps and bounds with your students if you give them this information. And I remember, novel studies in high school and being asked these questions that weren't surface level questions, but not knowing how to approach answering them, right? If you don't have that, okay, so in this type of question, when I'm asking you about this is how I want you to answer it, right? I want you to get information around these ideas and bringing them together and teaching them how to bring in their background knowledge. I can very vividly remember reading The Prince in social studies in grade 11. And, a chapter for one of them, I think, is like 1 or 2 paragraphs. And just having the teacher alert us, well, you have to go deeper than the surface level of the words. And, him taking the time to go through word by word, sentence by sentence, and giving us the different alternatives, how we could interpret this information, that was a hugely valuable lesson. And it wasn't English class. He wasn't teaching us comprehension. It wasn't a comprehension lesson, it was a social studies lesson, but he was telling us how that we could dig deeper. And, you know,
So
I
he
think
was a reading teacher. He was a reading teacher.
Exactly. It was one of the most valuable lessons that I had.
I think you bring up an important point too in terms of scaffolding. And for people who wonder what scaffolding is, if you think about a scaffold in a building, you put this framework around the building so that you can get to the top of the building when it's being refurbished or fixed, and it goes around. You've seen these in tall buildings. Well, scaffolding in learning is making those steps easier for a student. So if you ask a student a question that's up here, like you were talking about, Kathryn,
Mm-hmm.
and the student can't answer it, probably the worst thing that you can do is to just move on to another student.
Yeah.
Ask somebody else, because that student who couldn't answer the question isn't going to learn anything. But if you ask the student questions that lead up to that answer, the student is benefiting, and everybody else who's listening to your questions is benefiting from that. I do this in the Connect to Comprehension scripted lessons. When I ask a question that's a higher level question, the question is there. The page where you'll find the answer is there. The page where you can cite the text evidence is there. But I also, in bold, list the other questions that you can ask if you need to get the student to be able to answer that high level question. So for example, if you were asking a question about compare and contrast, and you were saying, how are these two characters alike? And the student can't answer that. So your questions would be, well, tell me about this character. Where does she live? Da, 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 da. And so you're having the student do that thought process by asking these scaffolded questions, and then you can go back to your upper level question and the student can answer. So that reminded me from what you were saying, Kathryn, your teacher showing you exactly what to do to get to what you needed was his way of scaffolding for you guys.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah.
Well, and even there were two things that I thought of. One is, I think a great way to do this is by using an annotated text or an annotated book where you have those little dropouts. Oh yeah, so I'm just thinking of the Charles Dickens, what is it? A Christmas Story?
Christmas Carol.
Christmas Carol, there we go. Yeah, so he has the annotated version of this book, and it has all these neat little facts and tidbits. And there are other texts that are annotated, but you can show them, okay, well, look, see, this is where we pull the background knowledge in, right? And you can teach them to annotate something that they're reading so they can actually show you where they're drawing in their background knowledge.
Yes. You know what I just noticed? It says there are only 2 participants. Are we live?
Yeah, sorry, this doesn't show us the participants on Facebook.
Okay, I was confused.
You're only seeing on Zoom.
Okay.
We are live, don't worry.
Okay. Will people be able to chat on this Zoom? Okay. So if you all have questions as we're talking, please feel free to put those in chat so that Kathryn and I can answer them as you have them. Or if you think of some later and you want to contact us, we both have our contact information out there, and so you can do that. Okay, good. I'm glad they're not just 2 of us here. Okay.
No, it's not just the 2 of us.
Okay, so we talked about scaffolding. I'm glad we've discussed that.
Yeah, and then the other thing that I wanted to bring up was another skill that has to do with comprehension is note taking and teaching students how to note take. You know, it's very easy when you're reading a paragraph, especially in a nonfiction text, to, you know, the first paragraph's the topic sentence, and that's kind of previewing what the information is. And then you get the supporting sentences, and then you have the concluding sentence. Well, a student may be like, oh, the topic sentence, well, that's what it's about. And then, so they take a note about the first sentence. And then after each sentence, like, oh, well, I need to have that in, and then I need to have that in. And you need to teach them, okay, we'll read the entire paragraph first. and then go back and figure out what the most important things and ideas and concepts from those paragraph is, so you're not writing the same thing over and over again, and you want to paraphrase what's being said in the paragraph, not just writing down verbatim.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of our dyslexic students, a lot of our struggling readers who don't know how to summarize, I think that's one really important skill that we need to teach them, that you summarize in your own words, and that you don't write down everything that you're reading as your summary. So using highlights and color coding and all of that is very helpful for teaching that kind of thing. I wanted to spend a few minutes, Kathryn, if we could, talk about the difference between skills and strategies.
Yes, thank you.
Comprehension and okay, so if that's okay for a few minutes. Okay. So I mentioned my students at the Schenck School who were in those Barnell Loft books, getting the main idea, sequencing, I can't remember all of them. But using context clues, and there were these little booklets that they worked their way through. And that's useful. Those are useful skills. But I think we need to step back and talk about comprehension strategies. On my brand new Connected Comprehension Center for Literacy Learning, I have a module on 8 essential comprehension strategies. And they're not things like cause and effect and making inferences. They're getting a bigger picture. So one of the most important strategies that we can teach our students is self-monitoring, because many of our dyslexic students, other struggling readers, are focused so, like we talked about, on reading the words, that they're not thinking about, do they understand what they're reading? And our more fluent readers get that, most of them. They can read and they know when they don't understand, and they know what they don't understand. But our struggling readers quite often don't even know how to ask those kinds of questions. So,
and they're just happy getting through the paragraph.
Exactly.
Okay, paragraph done. Next one.
Next one.
Not, well, did I actually understand that, or do I need to go back and reread it? The concept of rereading it's just no.
Yes. So that to me is a huge strategy. If we can teach our children, our students, to self-monitor, to first of all know when they don't understand. Oh, I just read that sentence or those 2 sentences and I don't understand. I don't understand. And then they need to know what they don't understand. Am I not understanding this because of a vocabulary word I don't get? Or am I not understanding it because the sentence is so confusing, the sentence structure? We hadn't even talked about syntax, Kathryn. Well, we could go on and on. Am I not understanding this because the structure of the sentence is so complicated? What is it that I'm not understanding? And then how do I fix it? Mm-hmm. So if it's a decoding issue, then the student needs to be able to use decoding strategies. But if it's a vocabulary issue, he needs to use vocabulary strategies. If it's a sentence structure issue, he needs to use strategies that are focused on sentence structure. And all of those things need to happen if we're going to teach our students to self-monitor. And another way so we can help them by putting little sticky notes at the end of, say, a passage where we have a question mark for them as a visual reminder. Go back and say to yourself, did I understand that? Do I understand what this sentence says? Do I understand what that paragraph said? Do I understand what this passage says? So little sticky notes are very helpful reminders for students. And I've used this for years, and it really has helped a lot. The other thing is to help students be able to generate their own questions. Now, they know how to answer our questions, but do they know how to ask their own questions? So if you can preview with them and say, okay, look at the title of this article. Look at the first few sentences. What kinds of questions can you ask yourself? And then put a little check mark when you've answered each one of those questions. So that's another way to get our students to actually think, to actually do metacognition, to think about their own thinking while they are reading. And that's something that, again, needs to be taught very explicitly. We can't assume that our students will know how to do that, will know how to monitor their own understanding. And that's critical, because if you don't do that, I've seen so many over the years, so many dyslexic students, struggling readers who, like Kathryn said, will get through a passage or get through a page and they're just, they just want to melt into the floor because they've finished. And you say to them, tell me what you've read. And they look at you like, what? I'm supposed to be able to understand this too. And a lot of times they say, I don't know. So they have to learn how to think while they're reading. And again, decodable text is so helpful for this, so that they're reading automatically. They're not struggling to decode every word. You've taught them how to read fluently in meaningful phrases. And all of that plays into the idea of self-monitoring. So see, this all ties together.
Right. Well, and that's something that I wanted to mention is because, there are going to be children in your class or students in your class that are not reading at the level of the textbook. You need to take that into consideration. So if they're at the frustration level when they're reading the text, or it's too difficult for them to read and comprehend what they're reading, you should really make sure there's some other way they can access the test. So having it recorded, but when they're listening to it, have them follow along in the book so they can see it and get the exposure, because that can help. It's not going to remediate the problem, but it can help them have the exposure to the words that they're supposed to be reading.
Exactly. I have a good story about the importance of audiobooks, and you mentioned that. I had an extraordinarily severe dyslexic student when I was working as a learning specialist at a private school in Atlanta. One of the brightest students I've ever met. He knew everything about everything. He just couldn't read. And I worked with him using Orton-Gillingham for 3 years. He was till he was in 6th grade, and he was getting ready to leave the elementary school and go on. And I had a conversation with his parents, and his dad, the sweetest man in the world, said to me, well, Lynn, is he ever going to be able to pick up a novel and read it? I mean, you've taught him to sort of read at a basic level, but is he ever going to be able to do that? And I said, you know what? I don't think so. But he is so bright, he's going to make it. And I hooked them up with, at the time, Library for the Blind and Dyslexic, now Learning Ally, that will tape books for you. And this wonderful young man graduated recently from Auburn University with an engineering degree. But he never read the textbooks. He couldn't, but he used Learning Ally, had every textbook taped, had his, it was obvious that he was dyslexic, had accommodations in place, and graduated and sent me his, an invitation to his graduation. And I just jumped up and down and said, whoopee, because he wasn't held back due to the fact that he was severely dyslexic. And the accommodations made for him let his intelligence shine through so that he could be successful. So that can happen, but like Kathryn said, we have to let our students have access to what they need in order to be successful.
Definitely.
Yeah. So
I think we've covered 2 of the skills so far: self-monitoring and generating your own questions. So what are the other 6?
Well, I'm not going to tell you all about them
Oh,
because I want you to go to the
yeah.
Connect to Comprehension Center for Literacy Learning and
Yeah.
read about all the others. But I will talk about one more very important strategy. Remember, we're not talking about isolated skills. We're talking about the big
Oh, sorry,
picture.
strategies. Yes.
Okay, yes. Oh, you said that. I just wanted everybody else to
Yeah.
remember. And I wanted to keep my own head straight. And another one that I put in my top three is being able to visualize as
Mhm.
you're reading, being able to make that movie as you're reading. So our fluent readers, and think about, we do this all the time. When I'm reading a book that has characters, I'm picturing the characters, and that helps me to keep them straight, and it helps me to make a deeper connection to the characters. So when I'm reading a description of the characters, I've got that mind picture. Um, and many fluent readers do this without even thinking about it. I mean, nobody ever told me, Lynn, you should make mind pictures, but I just do it because I'm a fluent reader. But our non-fluent readers don't know how to do this. And so, like everything else, we need to provide explicit instruction in how to visualize. And that seems really simplistic, but it's really important. And so you can start by having students draw pictures, read them one or two sentences, and have them draw what they picture when you're reading those sentences. And then extend the length of the sentences, extend the difficulty of the sentences, and have them draw until they get the idea that they can do that kind of drawing in their heads. So you can tell them, make a mind picture, or later on, make a movie. Make a movie of what you're reading so that they get the idea of the plot. Um, it's also important. Nancy Bell has written a wonderful set of materials called Visualizing and Verbalizing. She
Mhm.
worked with Dr. Linda Mood. So if you've heard about the Linda Mood Bell um, organization. She's the Bell part of the Linda Mood Bell. Um, and she put together a wonderful set of materials called Visualizing and Verbalizing. And she talks about how important it is to have students not only be able to visualize, but to verbalize. So once you've read the sentence to them about a dog or a character or whatever, and they've drawn their picture, they should be able to tell you what their picture is, so that you're having them, so that they're basically making a summary of their picture. And later on, when they're making their mind movie, have them be able to go back and tell you what is in their mind movie. So it's not just visualizing, but it's being able to visualize and then verbalize. So that's the other strategy that I put way up there besides self-monitoring, generating questions, and visualizing. And if you want to read about the others, you'll have to go to the Center for Literacy Learning website.
Wonderful. Well, a couple strategies that I often advocate for, especially for the students that have written output issues and dyslexia, is helping them learn how to visual note take while they're reading, or also using something like Doodly to create a little movie of it so that they can refer to it and get access to it, so they don't have to depend on their working memory and long-term memory for things. And it can really be really useful for when they have to refresh and review for testing.
That doodling is a great idea, and kids love to do that. They
Yeah.
think it's fun, but it's actually a great way to, like you say, to relieve the issue of working memory, so that they have something to help them bring back what they've been reading about.
Yeah.
Yes. So we've covered a lot about comprehension in just an hour, don't you think?
I think
You've
you did a
done a good
great job.
job. So if you all have questions, please let us know. Do we have any?
I don't have any as of yet. There's a little bit of lag between what we're us live and live on Facebook. But we
Okay.
can give a few moments. But thank you so much for joining me this evening. I've really enjoyed our conversation. And look forward to more in the future.
Good. Well, I've enjoyed it too. And like I say, I love talking about this with folks because um, there's so much out there about comprehension, and we can lose our way, I think, in all because it's such a huge component. And like I said, it encompasses all of the other reading components, and it encompasses so many skills that we have to teach our students. And the other thing about comprehension is it never ends. Teaching comprehension never ends. When you teach decoding, when you teach reading skills, once a student has mastered all the phonetic patterns and all the syllabication skills, you're done pretty much, right? Once a student has mastered fluency and he can read in meaningful phrases and he can read at a reasonable rate and he can read with good accuracy, you're done with fluency, right? You're just going to increase the level. Vocabulary is never ending. I learn new words every day. I get a word of the day on my computer, and I learn a new word every day. Some of them I know, but a lot of them I don't. So vocabulary is a never-ending endeavor, and comprehension is a never-ending endeavor because we have to teach literal comprehension, and then we have to teach inferential comprehension. And then we have to teach evaluative comprehension, where you're thinking about the author's word choice and the author's purpose and the effectiveness of the author and all of those kinds of things that we have to be able to evaluate. So this is a continuum that just goes on and on and on and on. So it's easy to lose our way. And I think it's good to have these kinds of conversations to kind of center ourselves in terms of what do we really need to be focusing on with our kids. So I think hopefully we've made that a little bit easier for you all tonight. So
Yes.
take care, everybody.